Excited to bring in our next guest who is here. Rupert.
Hey, Becca.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I am great. I've been talking or watching this or some version of this for, I guess, like 4 hours now, but it does not feel that long. It feels like it's been 15 minutes. So it's been a blast.
It's a marathon. I'm glad. It's cool to see people like waking up in different time zones as the thing progresses.
Totally. It's super fun. Well, thank you so much for joining today. Maybe we can just sort of start with like you just giving us all kind of like a little bit of a quick intro to yourself and what you're building.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Rupert. I'm CEO at Unternet. We're a relatively new company, started in August, and we're basically building a new intelligent workspace for the web. And I guess we can unpack a little bit what that means. But it's definitely in response to what I think is like an upcoming platform shift that I think has been discussed a bunch about like what happens when we take this raw material of these intelligent models and importantly, like combine that with the open software ecosystem we have with the web and build something that is like a more humanistic interface to computers instead of what we're used to. My background, like I've been working in this area for a while now, actually. I started off in 2018. I joined Google Creative Lab after doing a bunch of other very like different things like in academia and design, stuff like that. And I joined the Creative Lab and we were working with like some of the early neural networks, kind of just when the big neural networks just started to really pay off. And yeah, I was doing a lot of work with artists building interfaces for them to record songs and like change their voice to different instruments, and also like writers to build writing tools. We built a lot of like rich interfaces using these models and fine tuning them. And I think like that idea of like taking the models and building something really rich, user-friendly and interactive out of this, like treating them less like people to chat with and more like this magical glue that now we can get a computer to adapt to the human form a bit more. That kind of kicked off a theme that I've kept with since. And then I spent a bit of time at Mozilla where I really got interested in applying that to the web and kind of like this open software ecosystem around it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned the intelligent glue phrase. That when you and I were talking about this the other day, that really stuck with me. I was wondering if you could sort of give us a bit of a more like sort of concrete example of like what that means. Like, what is the difference between, intelligent glue and kind of like a chat interface in terms of how one might interact with or use different models?
I think like the best example I've had recently was I did so I was part of the BetaWorks camp last year, which is how the company kicked off. And I did a demo of like this early client I was developing, which will eventually turn into our client, which we're going to release soon, where basically like I did a natural language query, it brought up a map. And then I said, like I brought up a map of like restaurants, for example, classic like looking up restaurants example. It's a bit cliche now, but it brought up a bunch of restaurants and I was like, great, can you like make me a doc with like all the phone numbers and stuff and just like, I just want vegetarian places. And then the model just by itself, without really needing to be programming this integration at all, it like took this map tool, read all of the locations on the map, and then turned that into a formatted document with like address, phone numbers, and it filtered it the way I asked for. And that wasn't programmed. The two tools do not know about each other. And actually the model is just essentially reading the data from one and putting it into the inputs of the other tool. This is using this protocol called web applets that we've been working on that allows the models to understand web software. And yeah, it just did it automatically. And I think that to me is really a very underrated superpower that the models have, which is to make two typically with traditional computing incompatible systems suddenly compatible with each other. That we really is very underspoken about. Like it's quite an incredible advancement in computing to just take one output and just shove it into the input of another thing and it works. And like I find that more important than the ability for a model to mimic a person. I think that has some utility for sure, especially in certain situations. But the idea of like passing natural language instructions and then turning that into concrete actions in software and gluing software together, I find much more like significant.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of a conversation Matt and I have recurring, which is about there's a difference between kind of, I'll call it user-facing features of a model and features of the model itself. Meaning, like what you're talking about, I think, is something that is abstracted away from the user, but makes it feel like magic. Like you just put something in and it works. I think that is, like, I agree with you that I think that we don't talk about that enough when it comes to, when we talk about like kind of the design of these systems and like the user experience. You mentioned,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no, I was just going to say, yeah, from a interaction design perspective, one of the biggest sources of errors and frustration in computers is like when metaphors break down, like when the behavior you think would have happened with something on your computer, like, oh, actually, this window doesn't talk to that window, or like drag and drop doesn't work, or like, this file, it looks like a file, but it's actually just a Figma thing on their server. It's not a real file. You can't save it anywhere. This sort of breakdown is like a big source of frustration. And also incompatibility between different tools. And the fact that there's a glimmer of hope that you could just make that disappear there's no hope of like everyone just getting along and making everything compatible. And I think there is a hope in sort of this adversarial compatibility stuff. That you can just like, oh, it doesn't matter if you don't want to talk to each other, we'll just make you.
Totally. You mentioned a little bit about the web applets protocol piece. Can you talk about that a little bit more? And like specifically, one thing I'm curious about is how can that sort of help preserve the open web ecosystem as AI becomes more prevalent?
Yeah, I think in terms of preserving the web ecosystem, that's like web applets is one part. Maybe I can do two separate things. So web applets is basically a very simple protocol on top of the web. It uses the web app manifest and a little bit of JavaScript, like a shim, like polyfill, that allows a model to see essentially like what is happening inside an app on the web, and also to then see like a menu of actions that it can take based on the current state. So really simple example that I said before is, you can pull up a little Google Map app. Maybe you could imagine that coming up in like a ChatGPT style thing. It like can pull up a map, and then it can use the map. So you can say, show me directions to like, what's the traffic on the way to work? It can use that to show you the directions, and you can say, oh, can you find me an alternate route that's going to take me less than 30 minutes? And it can actually like work out how to use the app. And I think that's like the next step of like these user interfaces, which is that it's not just that you're making some background API calls, you're actually like allowing the model to use the software with you that you can see and then interact with directly yourself too. Getting that visual feedback is really important. So the protocol is like, we've got it up now. You can find it on our GitHub and on our website, Unternet.co. It's very easy to integrate. I think like in terms of the open web side, this is like a way for models to use tools that is completely independent of like one client or company. So we're working on a client that will use it. There are some other folks working on some clients out there and building their own web applets. The idea is to have this shared vocabulary, and importantly, to then host it on the web. So it's like to access one of these tools, you don't need to download it or host it yourself. You just like need a URL, just like any website. And I think this is also really important for publishers to be able to, publishers, I mean like literal publishers like a magazine or a newspaper, or like just me making my website or making an app, to then allow like hooks into the website to show the model how you want it to be presented to the user. And instead of just having the model kind of like make these background calls and make up its own user interface, to be able to actually take a part of a website. So if you're like looking up an article on the New York Times, you could have it, present actual web content to you and then allow the model to do stuff with that.
That's actually like a perfect segue into another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is sort of about like this idea of open source and also like publishers. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about sort of the role that you think open source should play in ensuring publishers and developers maintain control over how their content and their apps interact with AI.
I mean, this is like really, you're seeing this, some of the big labs right now try and make direct backroom deals with publishers, and this has been happening. There's like some of it's in the news, some of it's not, but like there are relationships that are starting to form with publishers and like OpenAI, Perplexity to get some of this like paywalled content on board. That is like the non-protocol route, and typically it sucks for everyone except for the big platforms, right? It's like publishers get screwed, which has happened with Facebook and all sorts of different platforms in the past, and users get screwed because like the sort of enshittification winches start to crank up, and like you're in that cycle again. And it kind of also just like minimizes the value and like allows one person to extract it instead of having this really, when you have the open web, you kind of like open up this incredibly lucrative for everybody ecosystem that everyone can benefit from. So yeah, I think that is kind of like the big problem. Protocols then allow you to make it so that you can have agreements between the different parties to solve that. I think one of the big things that is on my radar and on Unternet's radar in the future is like, how do we work with people to allow payments to be part of that? Because paying for stuff is really important. And there was like kind of one of the missing pieces of the like initial web that we have now. And I think we have the opportunity now to integrate that and to allow like me to access, or my model even to access some content from the web on the fly and just pay small amounts of money for it.
That actually, I'm also really glad you mentioned the web payments thing, because we were chatting about this a little bit the other day. How do you think that kind of web payments integration with AI can change the economics specifically for like open source developers or people working with open source?
It's a good question. Before I move to that, I just want to also, on the publishing note, I should mention that we're planning a workshop on like the future of publishing on the web and how we can keep the web open and not turn it into AOL. And so if anyone's interested in that, they should definitely reach out. My email's on our website. But yeah, in terms of like, the question was around web payments and protocols and how like web payments can help open source developers in this space.
Or if you think that will have an impact potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are like many ways that could go. The immediate benefit that I see with payments is allowing anybody to really easily participate in developing software and shipping it to a lot of people very easily. And a big barrier for people producing apps, and also like a big step that forces a lot of people to create closed source software, is payments. Because like, if you want to get paid for something now, you're like, well, I got to create a server and I need to have user accounts. And like, now there's all of this infrastructure that I need to build. I need to have like credit card details. If we can take some of that and put it on the client side, instead of making servers do all of this work, I think it's both empowering for users and also for developers, especially open source, to be able to get paid for their work.
Totally. I guess I know I'm trying to be mindful of time as well. Is there any closing thoughts that you want to leave us with?
I guess like my closing thought is that I think we have a huge opportunity to make computers more humanistic and accessible to people and empowering. But that's going to go in one of two ways. I think this is the fight on our hands right now, especially like in the open source world, is like that's either going to get to this sort of a few huge platforms dominate this area, or we all agree on some stuff that we can do to work together and build like the open web, but like way better, and make it even more like lucrative and beneficial to everyone. So yeah, I think let's fight for the latter. It is going to be, but I think it is going to be like a fight, and building really good products for users is going to be the thing that helps us. And yeah, I just definitely encourage people to, if they're interested in that idea of like creating an open app layer on the web, please check out Web Applets, get in touch, jump in our Discord. We've got an Unternet Discord on our website, where we love collaborating with people. So yeah.
Awesome. And we'll make sure to share out all those links and everything. Thank you so much for joining. That was a fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having me.